Welcome to the season of Advent. We begin the fourth and last week of the Advent season. In this Sunday's Gospel, we have a very moving scene. Mary, the young woman who has just been called by God, goes to visit Elizabeth, her cousin, and a mature woman. Both women are with child. Mary is just beginning her pregnancy, while Elizabeth is on her 6th month. The gospel scene is traditionally called the Visitation. The traditional interpretation of this scene is that Mary went to help Elizabeth with her pregnancy. This is a very pious interpretation that makes very little sense because it does not take into consideration Mary's own journey. First of all, it was usually women with the experience of pregnancies who helped pregnant ones. Mary is young and has no experience with pregnancies. Secondly, it is Mary who is in need of help. Mary's life has been turned upside down with the message of the Archangel Gabriel. Mary is probably around 14 years old, maximum. She's trying to make sense of what God has revealed to her and the implications of this revelation. So we have to take into consideration the age of Mary, the inexperience of Mary, not only physically but also psychologically and spiritually. And who does she go to speak about her own experience, her own journey? She goes to visit Elizabeth, her cousin, who has also been visited by God. Elizabeth, on the other hand, is on her 6th month of pregnancy. In her mature age, she has been visited by God and granted the child that for many years she had prayed for in her youth. God definitely has a sense of humor in answering Elizabeth's prayer in her old age. The Gospel of Luke says that Elizabeth secluded herself for 5 months, contemplating what God had done in removing her shame for being a barren woman. Elizabeth is a mature woman physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. Her 5-month seclusion gives the impression that Elizabeth has been contemplating God's mystery and sense of humor in coming to her in her mature age. Why did God take so long to grant the answer to her prayers, which most likely Elizabeth had already forgotten in her old age? This is the God of surprises. And also, this brings into focus the notion of Kairos, the Kairos time of Jesus, of God. Kairos time is not chronological time, but rather the time when God determines that things will take place now, the opportune time, the time of grace, the time when God decides. And this is how God chose to do things, by surprising this mature woman and also calling this young woman whose life is turned upside down. Mary visits Elizabeth not to help her, but to seek answers to her own situation. The Gospel gives us a scene made for a musical. As Elizabeth rejoices at seeing Mary visiting her, Mary sings a hymn of praise in response to her words. Mary runs in haste to the house of Elizabeth. What's the hurry of Mary? Why is she in such a rush? Yeah, I think the Gospel of Luke gives us the impression that Mary is seeking answers to her own particular journey. In her youth, in her immaturity, in her not knowing what to expect and what to make of God's revelation to her. She is confused and perplexed. She needs to make sense of her own experience. When she arrives, Mary and Elizabeth look at each other. And this is the way I imagine the scene. This is the way that, as a man, this is what I imagine and contemplate in this visitation. Mary comes, knocks at the door. Elizabeth opens the door. Mary cries in confusion, while Elizabeth, who has spent the last 5 months in seclusion and contemplation, smiles, comforts, and reassures Mary that all will be well. Mary comes into the house, and both women share their experiences of what God is doing in their lives. Again, the contrast between the young woman and the older woman, the immature woman and the mature woman, the woman who Mary, who is inexperienced and also barely growing and into this call that God has given her, while Elizabeth, in her maturity, in her especially spiritual maturity, she serves not only as a comfort but also as a guide to Mary as Mary begins her own journey. The all-powerful God becomes one with us in the taking of the fullness of our humanity in Jesus. These two women, Mary and Elizabeth, are not just vessels of God's Spirit, but also courageous and faithful witnesses of the God of surprises. God chose to become vulnerable and in the process model for us the way of faith, love, mercy, and compassion. God dared greatly. He risked greatly in becoming one with us. And in this daring greatly by God, we can also say that Mary as well dared greatly in saying yes, just also as Elizabeth dared greatly in allowing herself to be surprised in her mature age by God. Now, the other question that for me it comes up in this beautiful scene is this: was it worth it? Worth it for God? Worth it for Mary? Was it worth it to dare and risk so much for others? This is the risk and the great daring that God took in becoming one with us, in becoming vulnerable. And the question for us is this also: is it worth it? Is it worth it to dare to risk for others? Because as disciples of Christ, then we must follow in His own footsteps. And in saying yes to God, we will also be risking a lot by not going after our own will, but rather seeking to fulfill God's will in our lives. A most blessed and joyous Christmas to all. My name is Father Tony Diaz, Claretian missionary.